Okay, it is the Last Supper, and I already gave it away, but the artist is Leonardo da Vinci. Who can tell me what stylistic period in which Leonardo lived? Okay, right, the 16th century, and we call that time period in Italy, what? The Renaissance, correct. And as we were discussing earlier this week on Monday, a lot of changes occurred during the Renaissance period. And part of the change came about as a result of this thriving interest in becoming an individual and trying to eliminate the control of the Catholic Church in the daily lives of not just artists but all walks of people, to the point where the person could be a free thinker. And we do start to see this manifested in art, particularly with what I showed you on Monday, the dichotomy that was set up in the example with Perugino's Christ delivering the keys to St. Peter and Botticelli's Birth of Venus. With Botticelli's Birth of Venus, again, this was our first reintroduction to the classical past as far as reviving pagan images. Also, if you remember from Monday, the pagan images were not worshipped as gods and goddesses at this time, but it was simply the attempt of the artists to recapture some of the romanticism of the Greek and Roman classical lifestyle. So we looked at Botticelli's Venus as an object of beauty, and he showed Venus as the superb example of feminine beauty and charm, rather than again, what his contemporaries felt it was pornography or pornographic. So in considering Perugino's Christ delivering the keys to St. Peter and Botticelli's Birth of Venus, a couple of things that I started to point out in those as far as composition was basically that it had a foreground, middle ground, and background. And we saw that the artist utilized this to carry the viewer through space, so that we had something in the foreground to draw our attention into the composition, and then a sense of this ordering of space, so that our eye then wanders to the back and extreme depth within the depth of the painting. There are a lot of other terms that we're going to go over, and we're not going to hit all of them with, one painting. I'm going to show you a series of paintings. But we're going to start to talk about the formal elements. And again, this is covered in your reading assignment that's on your assignment sheet. I think it's starting with page 42 or 46, where it takes you through all of the elements and principles of design. Now, first of all, just to cover some of the background information, because again, I think it's important to know a little bit about the history of the painting, a little bit more about Leonardo, before we actually analyze this particular painting. We mentioned Leonardo da Vinci the first day of class when I showed you his portrait of the Mona Lisa. Lisa being, again, the banker's wife in Florence. And I told you the story of how when Leonardo had Lisa come to his studio to sit for her portraits, he hired musicians to play for her to make sure that she was relaxed, she was complacent, and he kept the sessions very brief and short so that she would not tire. Another thing that I mentioned about that portrait is that, in the history of art, why was it so significant? And we discussed the fact that because she is smiling. And if we, again, do a little bit of research and understand that he went to these lengths to make sure that she was comfortable and pleasant and entertained while she sat for the portraits, then that basically explains why she has that nice, pleasant smile on her face, which again was something that was not done before. It was not done before. In portraiture up to that point in time, people were, again, like I had mentioned before, very poker faced. They would not express emotions of any kind. Another thing about that particular painting that I didn't mention, I don't believe I mentioned on Monday, is that when Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa, it was painted with both using tempera paints. And who remembers what tempera paints consist of? Yes, go ahead. Right, natural pigments with, what kind of binder did they mix it with? Egg, correct. So tempera paints were used on painting the portrait of the Mona Lisa, but also he started to experiment with a new medium that had been introduced in the 15th century, just prior to his experimentation with this media. There was an artist in Flanders by the name of Johannes van Eyck, and I'll be showing you a work by Johannes van Eyck next. But he started this experimentation with taking natural pigments and mixing it with an oil binder, a linseed oil. And he is attributed to the development of oil painting. Well, considering that Johannes van Eyck lived in Flanders, which is now where Belgium is located, and considering that this is, at that time it was the 15th century, we don't have, mass media as yet, Leonardo had heard about some experimentations with using the new oil medium, but he didn't, get to travel. He didn't travel and look at the work of Van Eyck to understand the techniques and the processes involved. So the Mona Lisa has a combination of tempera and oil paint, but the oil paint that was used is very limited. All right, now, what makes this important with the Last Supper is we went over on Monday fresco techniques. What is fresco? What is a fresco? Okay, right, it is a painting on plaster. You have your text sheet? The fresco is painting on plaster, whether it's wet plaster or dry plaster. And if you also remember from Monday, I made the comment that if you paint on wet plaster, it's a much more durable form of fresco because there is a bonding that occurs between the limestone in the plaster and the pigments themselves. It dries basically to a rock-hard surface, and it is almost inseparable from the wall, again, unless something is damaged or damages the wall itself. So what we have here is Leonardo, who also I want to mention, and you'll read this in his biography, that painting was not his primary profession. We tend to overlook his scientific achievements and his studies in botany and anatomy, or you might be familiar with this, that he was first and foremost a scientist. And what we have to understand also about Renaissance man is that he didn't just specialize into one profession. Michelangelo himself was a painter, a sculptor, and an architect. He also found time to write poetry. We think we're stressed out and we have too much to do. Thinking that Michelangelo would take up to a year or 2 years for one sculpture, where did he have time to put the dome on St. Peter's in Rome and build the government buildings at the Capitol Hill in Rome and still work on Leo X's tomb and Julius II and work for the Medici family and then write poetry in the meantime? But these artists and individuals a lot of times crossed over the lines between architect-artist or scientist-artist. In the case of Alberti, I believe I mentioned him on Monday, Alberti, who came up with the laws of linear perspective. Remember, we talked about one-point perspective and linear perspective? He was a mathematician, but yet he was also an architect, plus there are some examples of artwork that was painted by Alberti. So these individuals were involved in a lot of different things. When Leonardo was commissioned by a monastery in Milan to paint the Last Supper in the refectory is the dining hall, he thought it would be appropriate to paint the Last Supper because it is a monastery, obviously it's a religious entity. The fact that it was to be painted on the wall in the refectory, which is the dining hall for the monks, he decided and chose creatively himself that it would be appropriate to show the Last Supper. But what he does with the compositional arrangement and the technique to create this was that he started to experiment with the oil medium, using it on plaster. Now, what the problem was with this, and you can probably imagine what the problem of this would be, is that if true fresco is painting on wet plaster with a watercolor base or a tempera base, and then we have a chemical bonding occur as the plaster dries, well, what do we know about the properties of oil and water? They repel each other, right? They don't mix. So what happens, and what did happen, is that when Leonardo painted this, he used oil paint. Now, the problem with that is that as the fresco started to dry, or as the plaster actually started to dry, what do you think started to happen to the paint? It started to flake off, correct. And the monks who commissioned him to do this mural were very upset with him because it was almost as if by the time he had finished the painting, the paint started flaking off the wall. You know, so what we see is that Leonardo, a great artist of the Renaissance, is trying to experiment with a new media, a new technique that he has only heard about. But it is, again, the sense of kind of like trial and error. In some respects, he was a genius. But in, you know, creating something like The Last Supper, it was a failure. And the fresco now in Milan, it is still there, was in serious trouble. About, I guess it was 84, they decided to start a restoration on The Last Supper. And they called in experts, and first thing that they did is they took infrared x-rays, which is common, to see what we call the cartoon drawings. The cartoon drawings would be what Leonardo actually sketched on the wall or drew on the wall to use as his guide for the painting. So the first step in restoration is to come up with what was originally there before the paint was applied. And by studying the cartoon drawings that appear beneath the layers of the paint, they can first of all determine the creative process involved, because they can see how many times Leonardo changed the original design. And in one area where this is evident is right here, the central figure of Christ. In the original composition, Christ was holding up a silver chalice, and a chalice is a goblet, right? He was holding up this goblet. Now, what you can't tell from just looking at a slide, and what you can't appreciate from the reproduction, is that Leonardo's reproduction, let's say, skills were so precise that if you could look at this tablecloth, you would see the cross-hatching, which created the linen effect on the tablecloth. He was extremely meticulous with detail. So what the problem was here is that Christ was holding in his hand a goblet, and Leonardo felt that the goblet was now becoming the focal point of the painting. Now, what is focal point? What would a focal point be?
What your eye sees.
Okay, right. What your eye sees first. This is also known as the point of emphasis. But he was so afraid that now the silver chalice was competing for the focal point away from the figure of Christ, but he wanted the figure of Christ to be the most significant and the most dominant. So he reworked the painting, he reworked the cartoon drawing, and decided to eliminate the goblet so that, again, we would notice Christ before we would notice any other figure. Now, another thing that we found out from studying the infrared x-rays was that, sure, after this was finished, the paint started flecking off. The monks were upset with Leonardo. Well, what happened to Leonardo around this time period? What happened when he was almost finished with the Mona Lisa painting? Where did he go? Did he stick around in Italy? Where did he go? Do you remember? He went to France. Did I tell you this story? I always get the Monday, Wednesday, Friday confused with the Tuesday, Thursday as far as what juicy stories I've told and what I haven't. But he leaves Italy. He takes the Mona Lisa painting with him. He never turns it over to the banker. And he goes to France, and he lives at the court of Francis I, or Francois I, who was King of France at this time. And that is where he remains. He does not return to Italy. The Mona Lisa painting that he took with him to Italy remained in the possession of the French kings all the way through Louis XVI, and once Louis XVI was sent to the guillotine and Napoleon scrambled into power, the Mona Lisa painting hung in Napoleon's bedroom. And it remained in Napoleon's bedroom until Napoleon established the Louvre as his national museum, or the National Museum of France, and then the painting was put in the Louvre. So anyway, Leonardo doesn't stick around long enough to hear the complaints of the monks. He goes to France and he's just like done with it. So the monks at the monastery will hire future artists to come in and try to repair the fresco. And by their repairs, what they basically do is they do what we call overpainting. They will come in, and where the paint's starting to fleck off, then they'll come in and they'll try to overpaint it to correct it. What we've been able to determine also from these x-rays is that the overpainting a lot of times changed the original Leonardo composition. As far as embellishing some of the features on the 12 disciples, it also changed some of the food and added on to some of the food that was on the table. And what is not clear from the fresco is that these are actually tapestries that hang on the wall, and you know, you don't see any detail on them at all anymore. They almost look like passageways with these being columns, but they're really tapestries that are hung. So what happened with the restoration? Oh, one other thing I wanted to point out. Do you notice this right here? Okay, this is a doorway. After the Last Supper painting was finished and Leonardo took off, the monks decided that they needed another door to get into the refectory. So they just arbitrarily started to cut into the fresco, and so we're missing all of this section of Leonardo's mural. They just kind of cut the legs out of these people and put in a doorway. But during the restoration process, the most important thing is we want to preserve it, but we don't want to alter the original design. We have to preserve it, otherwise the paint's just going to keep flecking off, and we're going to have nothing. Or we can try to save it right now. And this is where we get into a bit of controversy between the preservation and restorationists, as opposed to some of the scholars that say, well, we shouldn't restore these, we should just let the ravages of time take their toll on these artifacts. So it's a big debate here. But what happened was, it was agreed that there would be measures taken to clean the fresco, remove the overpainting, and try to bring it back to the original idea and concept of Leonardo back in the 16th century. So they hired a team of restorationists, and it was headed up by a woman who did most of the restoration herself. It took almost a 10-year time period to complete it, and the area that was worked on in a day's time was the size of a postage stamp. Now, you are seeing a very small version of this painting. If we could look at this entire back wall here, the painting would be approximately that size. So we're talking about a very large mural here. But what happens, and also I want to point out that my slide was taken before the restoration, It's not to say that the restored Last Supper is in much better condition, but you can see more of the details of the tapestry, and they have corrected the overpainting that was done by later artists. So it's a little better, but still it's not going to be clean and crisp and pristine as it was in the 16th century. This is just something that we don't want to alter too much. He did use an oil paint. Paint is flecking off. All we want to do is try to save what's there. Now, if we go into the composition, though, and going back to this idea of creative process and thinking about what was Leonardo thinking about when he painted this, and I mentioned the fact that he changed the composition because of the goblet, and he was afraid that the goblet would take away from the image of Christ. He started to compose the composition so that our attention to Christ or towards Christ was reiterated using different things. And I'm going to be very nebulous and vague right now. But there are a lot of subtleties and subliminal messages within this painting, so that we continuously go back to view Christ, which again in his mind should have been the most important character in the subject. Just in case there's any question, I'll back up a little bit. The story as it is related in the New Testament excuse me, is that this was the Christ's Last Supper. This is when he gathered his disciples around him. He knew that the next day he would be arrested. And he has just announced to his disciples that one of you will betray me. So in Leonardo's setting up of the composition, these words have just been spoken. What we see then as a result of those words is that we see the disciples heavily engaged in conversation, kind of shock, dismay, thinking, no, how is this going to happen? We don't believe you, that there's somebody amongst our group that is a traitor. And so he's trying to capture the spontaneity of the moment. But what he does, and it's very clever. Now, on Monday I mentioned linear perspective and one-point perspective. What is that? How could we put that into simplified terms? If we're using one-point perspective, do you know what that is? Okay, right. We're using a central vanishing point, a one vanishing point, where all of our lines are going to converge to that vanishing point. So if we look at the ceiling and the rafters in the ceiling, where the wall meets the ceiling, plus the lines of the tapestry, everything is directed back to a central point. And where does that point converge? Right here in the head of Christ. Okay, so that is subliminal, but it still is something that we keep going back to this figure. We may not know why, but if we analyze the composition, we can tell why. It's because the line direction is creating Christ as a focal point. Another thing that he does is he isolates Christ. Notice how Christ is placed in front of an open window, which is also how we saw the Mona Lisa, placed in front of an open window. This was common for the 16th century. But by having Christ placed in front of the open window, we get some backlighting with front lighting so that the silhouette of the head stands out in even greater detail from the rest of the figures that are in the composition. Another thing that we see that is subliminal is that if we look above this window, we can see what we call a lunette in architecture, a pediment, a segmented pediment or a lunette, which introduces, what do you think he put that there for? Are you familiar with religious paintings? What do saints and halos, right. Instead of painting the halo around his head, he implies the halo here with the bit of architecture that's framing the doorway, or the window. Another thing that he does is he does isolate the rest of the disciples from Christ himself. Now, if we thought that this would be enough reinforcement to get the idea that Christ is the main figure here, he even goes beyond that. We know that there were 12 disciples, right? 12 disciples. Notice what he does with the grouping of 12. We have a group of 3, a group of 3, a group of 3, and a final group of 3. We have 12 disciples here. He groups them together. If we notice the first group right here, what do we notice once we see this group? What are we noticing here? Where does our eye go from this point? Okay, back to Christ. And how does Leonardo set this up? The faces, the glances, the gestures. Can you see how this man has his arm around these two and he's pointing his finger? So our line direction then comes back to Christ. We can follow this within each group. These three disciples are conversing together, but again, we get this sense of line direction that takes us back to the central figure. Another thing that I want to point out, and I'm going to point it out just because it's such a bad reproduction, is that this disciple is the only one other than Christ who is touching the surface of the table. What clue might that tell us as far as which disciple that is? The one that will betray him, Judas, exactly. But again, it's very subliminal. Now, if we start with the group on the other side, then we again see the same thing. A group of three interacting together, responding to what he just said. Here we have again the gazes directing their eyes towards Christ. And the same thing with the final group. They are all involved in their own conversations, but again, the gestures of the hands take us back to the figure of Christ. So, one of the things that we're going to discuss, and especially when we get into modern art, is how much of this is intentional and how much of this is just subliminal. Is it a conscious effort from the mind of the artist to put in these clues, put in these signals, to try to get across these subliminal messages, or is it just something that comes natural to him? This will be something, again, that we'll continually talk about under the section of painting and sculpture. A lot of people, and it works the same with analyzing literature and poetry. A lot of people might read a story, and then they go, you might be taking a literature class, and you read a story, and then your professor gets up there and tells you all of this stuff about what the story means and how it might be, similes for something else or some kind of a parable, and you're going, huh? What? I didn't get that out of it at all. They used to say, read between the lines, read between the lines. Some people, it just might not come together. It's so subliminal that maybe to the conscious mind, that point isn't clear to them. If we analyze paintings, there's a lot going on within a painting that will also make us have a certain response. We might not know why we have that response. We just have that response. If we analyze it, and especially analyze it based on these formal elements like line and perspective and use of space, and there are other things that are included like volume and scale and proportion and rhythm, we will understand then why a particular painting affects us the way that it does. So keep this in mind also, especially when we go into modern art, because modern art is something that most people don't understand. They don't understand it because in a lot of cases it's very simplified, it's very childlike, very abstract, but it is directly related to the time period in which it was created. In the same way that when Leonardo painted the Last Supper, people thought he was a genius artistically because we see the interconnectedness and the interrelatedness of groups in conversation that was kept to a minimum in the 15th century and even prior to that time period. So it's all comparative. It is, looking at something that Leonardo had done and seeing how he was able to influence future artists. Now, I'm going to back up a century, I don't usually do things out of order, but there's a reason why I wanted to do the Last Supper first, and then take you to Johannes van Eyck and show you his painting of the Arnolfini Wedding Portrait, or the wedding of Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfini. Now, Johannes van Eyck was from Flanders, and he painted using oil paint. He was the artist that was attributed to the development of using linseed oil as a binder and mixing it with his natural pigments. If we look at the Arnolfini Wedding Portrait, again, there are certain things that are included in this composition that for us to look at it now, we lose a lot of the associative value. We probably can understand more of the religious works today because Christian religion or Catholicism is still a very strong religion in the 20th century. But if we take something that was not painted for religious purposes, something that was painted for more social purposes, then we tend to lose our interpretation of what is actually going on within the painting. So what I want to do is to open this up to ideas. First of all, you've had a little introduction to certain things will influence you, but you might not know why. First of all, I want to get your feedback as far as, what is going on in this painting. And I did give a big part of it away by saying it's the Arnolfini Wedding Portrait. But what do you see going on within the painting? Are there questions that are raised in your mind? Anyone? Yes. Okay, it looks like a shotgun wedding. Was somebody else going to say that? She looks pregnant, all right? What else do you notice? What else might raise questions in your mind? Okay, the dog. We're going to address all of these, but I want to get them all out in the open first. What else do you notice? Did you have something to say? They do or don't look? Okay, that's a good point. He said they don't look like they're too much in love with each other. Neither one of them look too happy in this portrait. What else? Anyone else? What else? Yes? Okay, that's a good question too. Why is he raising his hand like that? What else? Well, we're not going to answer any of these questions yet. We're just going to raise the questions first. What other things do you notice? Why are they in the bedroom? Okay, why are they in the bedroom? That's a great question. What were you going to say? She's not wearing white. That's a very good point too. What else do you observe about this? Anything else? Okay, nothing else. Okay, now I'm going to point to some things, and again, we'll address these questions, but I'm going to point to some other things here. Notice the chandelier. Okay, and again, I know we're looking at a slide here, but notice the chandelier. There's only one candle in the candle holder. All of the other candle holders are empty. There's one candle, and that one candle is lit. There's a flame coming out of it. Can you kind of see that up there? Okay? Now, if you look directly underneath the chandelier, there's some writing right here. Did you notice that? Okay. Now, if we look underneath the writing, we can see something right here, and I'll just let you know right now, it's a mirror. Okay, and if we look closely at the mirror, all right, can you see now that it's a mirror, and here's the back of this woman, and then it's very dark, but we can see the back of this man. Right between them, there's another figure. Okay? Now, if we look to the left of the mirror, we've got something hanging right here. And again, I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is yet. We have something hanging here on the wall. And to the right of it, where we do see the bed with the canopy and the headboard, we see two things. We see a whisk broom. You know what a whisk broom is? One of those little hand brooms. And coming up off of the finial of the bedpost is a statue of a woman right here. Okay? We have a settee, which is like a sofa, in the background. Now notice around the sofa, we have a pair of shoes here. Did you notice those shoes? We have a pair of shoes here. We have a very nice oriental rug, nice hardwood floors. We did mention the fact that there was a dog here in between them. Over here, we can see another pair of shoes. Now we can't see her feet. We can see that he is barefoot. Okay, so we're assuming then that maybe these are her shoes as well. These are his shoes. If we look behind the man, what do we see on the chest, which is the piece of furniture here? What do we see but fruit? We also see fruit ripening in the open window. All right? Now, one other thing I want to point out is the way that both of them are dressed. Can you tell that this is a type of fur? Maybe you can see it more clearly around the bottom where you can see it's like a mink. Okay, there's also fur around the top. If we look at the woman, she has on a lot of gold. All right, now after I've pointed out some more things, what other kinds of questions might you have before we answer them?
Why are they barefoot?
Okay, why are they barefoot is a good question. what do all of these symbols mean? Again, we're in the 20th century looking back to the 15th century. We have to try to understand the social climate of the 15th century for Flanders, in the same way that we would have to understand religiously what went on, politically what went on, and economically what went on. Now, this painting tells us a lot economically, first of all, because from my standpoint of my background, which is interior design and furniture history, these people are extremely wealthy, and I can tell that because of the furnishings that they have in their bedroom. Typically for the 15th century, furniture was very rare, and the bed was the most expensive piece of furniture that you could ever own. So this tells me that they have great wealth. To the layman who might not be that familiar with furniture styles or furniture, look at the clothing. You could look at the clothing and the gold jewelry and deduce the fact that they were very wealthy, okay? This is something that we can interpret from just studying the painting. Now, another thing about this is, okay, socially, sure, we know that, or economically, sure, we know that these are wealthy individuals. If we try to now bring in the social aspects and then the religious aspects, all right, being with the religious aspects first, this is a clue, plus what you can't see from just the slide is going around the mirror in these little round circles here are scenes from the Passion of Christ. The Passion of Christ is his last days on earth. It's the last judgment for him, the crucifixion, etc. So this is representing going around the roundels of the mirror. Then if we know that this is religious, these are religious images here, then what might this be? Well, actually, it's a string of beads. What might that represent? The rosary beads, okay? Rosary beads. All right? Now, if these are rosary beads, then we know that these individuals were religious in the sense that they practiced Catholicism. This is 15th century. This is before the Protestant Reformation, okay? Now, to the right of it, I'm just going to hit on the religious symbols for right now. To the right of it, ignore the broom for now, but remember I told you that there was a woman carved on this bedpost. Who might the woman represent? Okay, could be Virgin Mary, but if any of you are really adept in Catholicism, you are familiar with the canonized saints. Saints who might not have lived during the time of Christ, but were saints that lived through the persecution era under the Roman Empire, who died basically under horrible circumstances because of their beliefs in Christianity. Saint Margaret, okay, Saint Margaret was the saint of childbirth. The saint of childbirth. I'm going to come back to this, so just keep that in mind. Now, they don't have their shoes on. They don't have their shoes on. Well, how would that be religious? Any ideas? Exactly. And it goes back to the Old Testament when Moses went up to the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments, and God told him through the burning bush, remove thine shoes, for thine are standing on holy ground. We still see in a lot of even Eastern religions where you are not allowed to wear the shoes into the house of God. So the removal of the shoes becomes religious. It's a religious symbol. The sanctity of marriage is holy. They are coming together before God to make this commitment to each other. All right, now let's go back through some of the other symbols and bring in the social implications. 15th century, how did people get married in the 15th century? Did they plan a wedding for months, invite hundreds of people, have it catered, meet at the church and have this big ceremony and then a big reception afterward? No, they didn't do it that way. Therefore, that answers your question of she's not wearing white, because it was you don't have a special dress for your wedding day. It was too expensive. I mean, even though these people are wealthy, plus wearing of white is a cultural thing, and it is something that is also only from 19th century forward. But the rules of getting married for the 15th century, all it required was for the husband and wife to come together, make a vow to one another. So somebody addressed the raised hand. He's making an oath. He's making an oath that he's promising to be this woman's husband, and she will return. You notice the joined hands. She will return the oath to him. And the only requirement by law is that they make these vows in front of at least one witness. So who is the witness? Not the dog, because the dog couldn't testify in court. But who is the witness? Go back to the mirror. Okay, remember I told you that standing between the two individuals is another individual. It happens to be a self-portrait of Johannes van Eyck, the painter. So he was the witness. This couple came before him, made their oath, and to make it official, remember the writing I told you about? The writing here? It says Johannes van Eyck was here, 1457. So he signed the document to witness the union between Arnolfini and his young bride, which brings up another point about the social implications here. A wealthy man generally married what class of woman? A wealthy woman, right? And if we go back to the 15th century, did people marry out of love? Never. They married out of obligation to the family. So we have a wealthy man who was oftentimes late 20s, early 30s before he got married, to a younger woman, and this is going to just blow you away, but guess what age a woman was considered to be an old maid? 16. She was an old maid if she was not married by the time she was 16. So here we have someone who's in his late 20s marrying someone who is 14 years old. She is not pregnant as what we thought she was pregnant. It's a social thing as well. Because what happens here is that if we study clothing styles, we realize that women at this time, in this time period, women, it was common dress for the high society to, first of all, shave their forehead, right? We thought we had unusual hairstyles, but they would shave their forehead so that they would have this very high forehead. They would wrap yardage around their breasts to flatten them, and then they would have what they call an empire waist, which is a high gathered waist, with yards and yards of fabric here. There are 12 yards of velvet in her skirt. So that the billowing effect, and you can see how she's kind of holding up her skirt, it gives us the impression of virginity. And this was a style. This was a style of dress for women, whether they were virgins or not. You had to look virginal. Now, another social implication then that goes with this is that, okay, it has to be witnessed, the oaths have to be made, the vows have to be made in front of a witness. If we extend that requirement of the law to one other stipulation, is that to make this marriage then legal, the couple has to consummate their marriage. So that explains why they're in the bedroom with the bed in full view. If that marriage was not consummated, it was null and void. Okay? Another thing about that then, if we know that the consummation of marriage happens in the bed, what else happens in the bed? Procreation, right? If you're going to consummate your marriage, they didn't have very sophisticated birth control back then. Not that they would want it, because the idea, why do you think we have fruit behind the man? Fertility, right? So this goes back to the fact that we have St. Margaret, saint of childbirth, carved into the bedstead, because where did women have their babies? At home in bed. They didn't go to the hospital. They had them at home in the same bed. And another kind of interesting thing that we see here, the whisk broom that's hanging on the bedpost shows us that the domestic duties of the wife the domestic duties of the household fall on the role of the wife. Because, let me just tell you something here. Back in this time period, the husband and wife had separate bedrooms. We are in the woman's bedroom. We know that because of St. Margaret on the bed, and we also know that because of the whisk broom hanging off of the bedpost. It was the woman's role, especially for a wealthy woman, to, first of all, satisfy her husband sexually, bear the children so that the name could continue, and oversee the domestic duties of the household. So it's almost like it's all concentrated right here, put on the woman. And notice the bed is on her side, and the open window and the fruit are on his side. Now, there's only, two other things that we didn't answer these questions for. Why is the dog there? Notice the dog is right between the two individuals. How many of you are studying Latin or have studied Latin? No one. All right. What do you think the word for loyalty is in Latin? What? No, not dog. Close. Fido. Fido. Have you ever wondered why do they call dogs Fido? It is
fidelity. So that's all for today. We'll see you next week.